Hi, my name is Beth Birmingham, and this is my oral history presentation. To learn about how immigration and migration has been a part of my family history, I decided to interview my grandma. I interviewed her on September 8, 2019, over the phone because she is located in Boise, Idaho. Some questions I asked my grandma include, tell me about your childhood and growing up, tell me the story about how you and Grandpa met, where you lived, experiences you had together, etc. And can you tell me a little bit about the migration of your great-grandfather? My grandma's story begins when she was born on December 12, 1940. At 3 years old, my grandma moved from Oregon to the Round Butte area of Montana and remained here for the entirety of her childhood. She told lots of stories about her family, school, and working on the farm where she lived. One of my favorites was about how she was afraid of animals when she was really little.
And went to the Round Butte, where my grandmother lived. And I was scared to death of animals. Just like I'd see a cow down at the barn and I'd scream and holler, kind of like my Bethy. But time I got to be like there, a year or two, I became very close to the animals.
The timeline of my grandma's life growing up is pretty standard. She attended school, helped out on the farm, and spent time with her family. Where her timeline gets exciting is in 1959 when she graduated from Ronan High School. I learned through the interview that after graduating from high school, my grandma moved to Boise, Idaho to attend Lynx Business College. My grandma was in Boise for 9 months before she met my grandpa in June of 1960. 6 months after they met, my grandparents got married on December 9, 1960. Within 5 years of getting married, my grandparents had 3 children, one of which was my mom. One of the main reasons I decided to interview my grandma is because I knew that she and my grandpa had migrated around the western region of the United States a lot. In the interview, my grandma explained all the different places she and my grandpa have lived throughout their relationship. As you can see on the timeline I created, my grandparents have lived in a total of 8 cities together, including Phoenix, Arizona, Portland, Oregon, and Boise, Idaho, which is where they reside currently. As my grandma explained how many times she and my grandpa had moved, the question, why were they moving around so much, popped into my head, so I decided to ask her that question.
Jobs,
Grandpa's jobs?
Yeah, and we improved ourselves each time we moved around.
After my grandma explained her and my grandpa's personal migration, I asked her to zoom out a little and explain the immigration of our Swedish ancestors.
My great-grandfather came to the U.S. in 1869. He and another brother, they were 6, I think, and we call him O.W. It's Otto Wilhelm Haig, H-A-E-G-T.
Mm-hmm.
And he and his brother came across the ship. I mean, one of them was, I think Otto was, my grandfather was older, and then one younger brother came across the ocean, and I don't know how long it took them to get across, but I think probably quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get to the United States, and they had friends, I think from Sweden, in Rockford, Illinois. So that's where they ended up.
To further understand what my grandma meant during this part of the interview, I referred back to a few family trees. Through these trees, I verified that O.W. Haig, my grandma's great-great-grandfather, and my great-great-great-grandfather lived in a town south of Stockholm, Sweden, called Esko before he immigrated to the United States. The 2 brothers left Sweden at 17 years old on May 3, 1869, and arrived in Rockford, Illinois. During the interview, my grandma explained that O.W. and his brother had immigrated to the United States due to hard times. Hard times is a pretty vague term, so I decided to look up what was happening in Sweden in 1869. From my research, I found that many famines caused by drought, flooding, and crop failures happened throughout Sweden during the 1860s. These famines ruined small farms, just like the one O.W.'s family owned. According to EuropeanEmigration.com, around 60,000 Swedes left the country during the years of 1867, 68, and 69 due to starvation. O.W. and his brother were 2 of the 60,000 to move. After my grandma explained O.W. and his brother's immigration story, there was a little piece of information that was missing. How did my grandma's ancestors get from Rockford, Illinois to Ronan, Montana? So I prompted her to explain that piece of migration.
Yeah, homesteading. The homesteading homestead in Montana opened up,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to put in for a lottery, and that was 1910. And they pay so much for this lottery, and then they draw the names out, and Uncle Harold, who is my grandmother's brother, got 160-acre lottery in the reservation.
Mm-hmm. I had never ever heard about the homesteading in Montana before my grandma discussed it in the interview, so I researched more about it after the interview was over. I discovered through the Montana Historical Society's website that from 1870 to 1890, railroad companies laid track all across the state of Montana. After doing this, they needed people to move to Montana and establish towns to support these railroads. So, the Milwaukee, Northern Pacific, and Great Northern Railroads worked hard to advertise the land in Montana to people around the eastern part of the United States and Europe. Settlers who chose to move to Montana and homestead there were offered special rates. My grandma's grandma and great-uncle found this deal appealing, so they decided to pack up their belongings in Illinois and homestead in Montana in 1910. After I was done interviewing my grandma and researching what she had told me about, I began considering a few questions. The first question I considered was, how does the oral history you recorded connect with the theme of immigration and migration? What additional social studies themes are there? Almost the entire oral history I recorded connects with the theme of immigration and migration. When my grandma explained all of the places she and my grandpa have moved to, she was talking about her own personal migration around the United States. When my grandma was discussing her great-grandfather's story about moving from Sweden to the United States, she was highlighting the topic of immigration. Throughout the oral history, a few other social studies themes were included. Geography was one of them, as she discussed many different cities and countries throughout the world. Montana state history was highlighted through the discussion of homesteading and what that meant. And lastly, the theme of global perspectives was highlighted through the discussion of Sweden and the hard times the country went through. Another question I considered was, what aspects of this oral history presentation could be shared with students setting out on their own oral history project? I think many aspects of this oral history presentation could be shared with students setting out on their own oral history projects. I feel that the most beneficial aspects of my presentation are the sections where I discovered what was happening in Sweden when my ancestors left and what homesteading in Montana meant. I think that sharing these parts of my presentation and explaining how I had to do some research to figure out events in my family's migration would encourage students to do the same in their own presentation. The third and final question I considered was, what aspect of the work could be strengthened or clarified before you plan your lessons? Before I plan my lessons, one aspect of the work that could be clarified is my dad's family immigration story. At the beginning of this project, I was so narrowed in on finding out about my mom's side of the family that I forgot to consider how migration and immigration has impacted my dad's side of the family. If I were to do this project over or extend it, I would interview my dad and a few of my uncles to find out more about the immigration and migration that occurred on his side of the family.